Now, just a quick review, right? We're in the middle uh, of the class on intermarriage, looking for possible explanations, possible ways that Jewish law might be able to sanction intermarriage. What kind of argument would I need to make in order to say that there's room in Judaism to permit the marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew? Now, it's hypothetical, and you see that I have to twist and twist and twist, but I want to cover the material just to show you what possibilities there are in the realm of Jewish theology and Jewish philosophy to get to that conclusion. That many of us came into this class thinking this was a black and white issue. It turns out it isn't so black and white, and on some issues, there might be room for movement, some room for the, let's say, limiting of barriers or the thinning of barriers. Now, where did we end off last class? With this fascinating and very challenging piece of Talmud that is so deliciously challenging, if I could use that word. It's so deliciously aggravating that I think I just want to review it with you one more time for the challenge that I think it leaves us with, both on this topic of intermarriage and on many, many other contemporary issues in Jewish life. But because it happened at the end of the last class, I think it's worth reviewing. So on the screen in front of you is the source sheet from week 1, because I want to refresh your memory on this. Remember the story of the attic of Hananiah ben Chizkiah ben Gurion. This is a story from the Mishnah in Masechet Shabbat that talks about the day when a few people from the house of Hillel were sick and didn't show up to the yeshiva or to the court or whatever sort of parliament they had to decide issues of Jewish law. And Beit Shammai found themselves outnumbering the house of Hillel. And on that day, they passed 18 regulations. 18 regulations were passed on that day. And these 18 regulations, they're sort of famous. The famous 18 rules that all relate to one issue where there was obviously, broadly one issue where there was obviously some disagreement between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. The house of Shammai wanted thicker barriers. You've heard the expression, some of you perhaps, a fence around the Torah. So the house of Shammai wanted a bigger fence around the Torah, but what specific part of the Torah? Well, the part of the Torah that, let's say, sanctifies or elevates the nation of Israel above the other nations. Not because they're better, but because we're afraid of the other nations having a negative, let's say, impact, having a deteriorating impact on Jewish practice. And so the house of Shammai builds these barriers between Jews and non-Jews, and they are discussed in the Talmud Yerushalmi, but we find that they included a prohibition on eating Gentile bread, a prohibition on eating Gentile cheese, on Gentile oil, and their daughters. So remember, this is very surprising. And we spent the last we spent one class trying to figure out a couple months ago already, trying to figure out why it is that Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai needed to ban intermarriage. Didn't it pre-exist? Doesn't it go way back? So remember, the Talmud tries to figure out, well, it wasn't a complete ban, and Hillel and Shammai came along and gave a complete ban on intermarriage, right? That it included bans on intimacy, it included private, it included public, all sorts of forms were banned by Hillel and Shammai, whereas the earlier prohibitions were of a lesser degree. Okay, now let's go to where we left off last week. This passage in Talmud Bavli Avodah Zarah. Rabbi Simlai publicly taught in Netzivin, Gentile oil. Rabbi Yehuda and his court voted on it and permitted it. Now, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, I thought they already had a vote. That happened before Rabbi Yehuda and his court. So an earlier court prohibited Gentile oil. That's what we just read. It was one of the 18 decrees. But then later, Rabbi Yehuda and his court overturned it. How could they do such a thing? How could Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi permit an ordinance from the students of Shammai and Hillel? How could he overturn something? Is it not taught? A court cannot annul the words of another court unless it is greater than it in number and in wisdom. Unless the later court sees itself as being greater in number and wisdom, it cannot overturn something that's already been decided. Furthermore, didn't Rabba ben Bar Chana say in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, one court can annul the words of another court on any matter? So he was more lenient, Rabba Bar Chana. He said, okay, a later court can come and overturn an earlier decision, but not on 18 things. Everything except for the 18 things decreed by Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, even if Eliyahu and his court, that means Eliyahu Hanavi. Okay, so you understand this sort of exaggerated language. Even if Eliyahu Hanavi comes back from the dead and says, we're going to change the rules, we can overturn the prohibitions of Hillel and Shammai, don't listen to them. We do not heed them. Why? Because these decrees spread throughout most of Israel. The ban on oil did not spread throughout most of Israel. So this is the final justification of the Talmud for how Rabbi Yehuda and his court were able to overturn the ban on Gentile oil. How did they do it? Because we have a statement in the Talmud from Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok, who used to say, you do not decree a decree on the community unless most of the community can uphold it. The people were not obeying the prohibition on Gentile oil. They weren't listening to it. On the other 17, they accepted it, and their behavior accommodated, or their behavior, what's the word? Their behavior sort of was modified because of the decrees. They respected the rules, except on Gentile oil. And we have a rule that if the people are not listening to a decree, you can overturn the decree. And actually, one of the questions I framed to you last week, a much more challenging question, is it you can overturn the decree? Is that what we're learning here? Or are we learning you must overturn the decree? Ooh, wow. Let's read this very carefully in the Hebrew. Ein gozrim gzeira al hatzibur. One does not decree a decree on the community. Ela im ken rov hatzibur yecholin la'amod bo. Unless most of the community can withstand it, uphold it, accommodate it. So I don't know how you all that to you to understand or to think about what does that mean? What are the repercussions of this? Especially in a world like we're living in today, where there are many decrees that most of the Jewish people don't follow? Are we obligated to eliminate those decrees? Should we review those decrees? And I introduce this source because, for a very, obvious reason, this could be used as a potential source to uh, eliminate the ban against intermarriage. Oil was one of those on the 18 prohibitions, Gentile oil, and so was their daughters. So was intermarriage. Well, if you can get rid of one of them because you feel that the community is not upholding it, well, what do we say today when most of the community is intermarrying? Perhaps we ought to review the ban of Hillel and Shammai, and the matter could be overturned. Okay? Could be overturned, or maybe must be overturned. Someone who wanted to make that argument, this would be a prime source. Now, there's one more source I want to look at here in the main section of the second part, and that's the Radbaz, just to show you that a person who wants to make the argument that intermarriage might be permitted if we play these games and pick out sources and use them to overturn history, just to show you that that would be a very, very challenging approach, a very, very challenging approach. Who shall I pick on? Who can read for me the Radbaz? I want to pick on some new people. Ruth, are you okay to read? Okay, I need you to unmute. Great.
Okay. Know that even though, is that the place? Yeah.
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah. Know that even though we hold that the daughter of a ger toshav is not killed by zealots, and there is no formal biblical prohibition associated with her, given that her father committed not to worship idols, nonetheless, there is a karit, excision on prophetic authority, as it is written in Malachi. And even though the verse, there sounds like it is only concerned about an idolater, it applies to all Gentiles.
So let's go over what the Radbaz is saying. I acknowledge that we do have this character in rabbinic Judaism called ger toshav. And the ger toshav, if you all remember, is a non-Jew who is non-idolatrous. Some say he has accepted all of the 7 Noahide commandments. So he and his family are certainly not killed by zealots, right? That's only for idolaters. And there's no formal biblical prohibition associated with her. So he says, it's not clear, even in the Torah, that you wouldn't be permitted to marry such a person. Why? Because her father committed not to worship idols. She's from a non-idolatrous background. But nonetheless, there is excision on prophetic authority. Now, what is the prophetic authority he's talking about? Well, some of you know the prophets are the second book of the second section of the Bible are called the prophets. And this was a verse we saw. I'm trying to find it here for you. We saw in our class, one of the first classes that we had together. Here it is. Ruth, would you read this for us? Judah has been unfaithful.
Judah has been unfaithful. A detestable thing has been committed in Israel.
You see it?
Sorry. A detestable thing has been committed in Israel and in Jerusalem. Judah has desecrated the sanctuary the Lord loves by marrying women who worship a foreign god. As for the man who does this, whoever he may be, may the Lord remove him from the tents of Jacob, even though he brings an offering to the Lord Almighty.
So the Radbaz cannot, thank you, Ruth, the Radbaz cannot find a verse in the Torah that prohibits intermarriage with a ger toshav, but he finds this. That's what he means when he says, but it's banned on prophetic authority because Malachi is a prophet. And he says that it is a desecration of God's sanctuary to marry women who worship a foreign god. Now, hold on. That sounds like Malachi is only talking about a woman from an idolatrous background, not a woman from just a regular ger toshav background. But look what he writes here. There even though the verse sounds like it's only concerned about an idolater, it sounds like it's only about an idolatrous woman, but it actually applies to all Gentiles. That's what the Rabbaz says. That verse in Malachi is a prohibition against intermarriage on prophetic authority, and one must obey that prohibition. Okay, keep going, Ruth. I wrote this because
I have seen some wicked people who desecrate God's name and rule permissively, saying that the Muslims are not idolaters. As Rambam wrote in a responsum, but they do not understand that even according to their mistaken ruling, there is still karit on prophetic authority.
okay, so that's interesting. Look at that. He says in his day in Egypt, 16th century, he saw some wicked people who apparently were marrying Muslims and using and as justification for that, were saying that because Muslims are not idolaters, you're permitted to marry them. Idolatry is the first order concern. Once we remove the first order concern, then there's no ban against intermarriage anymore. And the Radbaz blames Maimonides. That's Rambam, right? Because Rambam was the one who said, this we reviewed last class, that Muslims are not in the same category as idolaters. They are like a ger toshav, particularly because Muslims are a culture, a people who, as an entire group, forbid idolatry, and therefore we have no fear that such a person would ever go back to being an idolater. They were never an idolater in the first place. So that's Maimonides' permissive ruling. But Radbaz here is protesting. He's staying firm and saying, I don't care what Maimonides wrote. On prophetic authority, there is karet. Karet means such a person is cut off from the people. Don't forget about that. We have to impose excommunication on somebody who marries out. All based on this verse in Malachi, which, you might say is not, doesn't seem to be all that clear that non-idolaters, it says very clearly in the verse, women who worship a foreign god. Well, Muslims don't worship a foreign god. They worship the same God. But the Radbaz says, no, that's not what Malachi meant. He meant foreign women. In those days, for him, a foreign woman was someone who worshiped foreign gods. But today, in our day, a foreign woman is any woman from any other religion. Okay, go ahead, Ruth, keep going. But I hold, whoops, sorry, I muted you by accident. Try doing that again. There we go. Okay, but I hold
that only a ger toshav who has accepted 7 Noahide laws is even up for discussion, but not contemporary Gentiles, who, even if they are not idolaters, are abominable in other ways, and they present a concern of causing people to stray from the ways of God. Their status is the same as that of any other nation, or a ger toshav is excluded, and even in that case, there is karit on prophetic authority.
So this is really interesting here. I want to just emphasize how the Radbaz ends this responsum, and I think this is an argument I hear from many people, and I've heard actually from some of you in our discussion portion of this class. I hold that a ger toshav has to he has to have accepted the 7 Noahide laws to even have a discussion on this topic, but not contemporary Gentiles. Now that's interesting. Why not contemporary? Why can a modern day Christian or Muslim not be put in the category of a ger? Well, because even if they're not idolaters, they are abominable in other ways. Okay, he's not clear on what that means, but you could think. But this is the big one for me. This is the part I would underline. They present a concern of causing people to stray from the ways of God. Not idolatry. Not that they present a concern of idolatry, that they're going to make the Jew go to a temple of Zeus and pray before Zeus. But what might your Muslim wife do? She'll take you to dinner on Friday night at a restaurant. What will your Christian husband do? He'll invite you to his parents' house for Christmas dinner and serve ham and whatever. It's not that so the Radbaz here is very interesting, and I think giving voice to something that I hear a lot of in contemporary Jewish discourse, that the argument about idolatry being the first order concern is almost archaic. Because what is idolatry today? Who is an idolater today? I mean, last week, remember, I was even trying to think with you like, okay, who is an idolater? And at the end of the class, I think I said that Zoroastrians were an idolater. And then someone said, I think it was you, Ruth, you said, no, Zoroastrians are actually monotheistic. It's like if you call any religion today, even if they're worshiping an idol in front of your face, if you call them idolaters, they will be horribly offended. Horribly offended. They'll say, no, it's just a representation. It's just a symbol. We don't actually worship this. So even today, it's a struggle to come up with, okay, who is an idolater? So that seems like an archaic notion that could be replaced today, especially for those among us who are very fearful about the Jewish future. What are we most afraid of today? It's not that our children are going to go out and worship in the temple of Zeus. It's that our children are going to go out and worship in the temple of modernity, consumerism, materialism, whatever you want to call the temple of modernity. That is our version of idolatry. And the Radbaz, I think, is the first source who gives language to that changing reality. And it's interesting. He's 16th century Egypt. Remember, the Muslim world was far more tolerant of Jews than the Christian world. So it makes sense that in the Muslim world, where there's more interaction between Jews, the Radbaz is actually saying, hey, I know some wicked people who intermarried. So now that was not the case in Christian Europe. I don't think there were many stories. I am not aware of any stories from Christian Europe of Jews marrying non-Jews and trying to justify it, especially with, oh, they're ger toshav. No, if a Jew married a non-Jew, he apostatized way beforehand. But in the Muslim world, it seems like there were Jews trying to justify going out and marrying Muslims because they said, well, there's no fear of idolatry here. So the Radbaz is preempting a discussion that happens 4 or 5 centuries later in the Jewish world in America, which is sort of has similar challenges, and saying, look, today the fear is different. Yeah, I know they're not idolaters, but they will cause the Jew to stray from the ways of God. Now that's another category of what it means to assimilate, straying from the ways of God. And that, he says, is what Malachi is concerned about. Malachi, yeah, he says the words, or Malachi. I'm supposed to say Malachi, but it depends on how I'm feeling. So Malachi, I'll use his Jewish name. Malachi says, women who you're marrying the daughters of those who worship foreign gods. But what he's really concerned about, Malachi, is Jews straying from Judaism. And that's not crazy. I just want to leave that with you as that's not crazy. It actually is deeply resonant. So the Radbaz takes everything that we've been talking about, the Ger Toshav, the 18 rules, the 18 decrees, the idea that we should overturn things if we can, he rips it all to shreds and says, a Jew who is loyal to the covenant is a Jew who does not marry anyone except for another Jew, period. And that is an early prohibition going back to the prophetic period. And therefore insurmountable. If a prophet says no, it's very hard to overturn that. I want to show you 2 more interesting texts in part 2 before we move forward that I think are worth reviewing. This text here, the ordinances of the Paris Sanhedrin 07. I wanted to present you these texts just to give you a sense of the context where, I said, so the Radbaz enters the modern period with the concern that Jews might stray from their religion if they marry somebody of a different faith. And these are 2 more, and I could have included much more, but 2 more modern sources where rabbis are grappling with the challenge of intermarriage in a more open society. If you remember this famous story of the Paris Sanhedrin, so what is the Paris Sanhedrin? Well, Napoleon was considering extending full civil rights to the Jews at the beginning of the 19th century. But before he granted them full citizenship, there were a series of questions that he submitted to the rabbis of Paris, asking them to provide answers that he and his group would review, and then based on those answers would decide whether the Jews were entitled to citizenship or not. And one of the questions that Napoleon asks of this group of rabbis, which is called historically the Paris Sanhedrin, but obviously the Sanhedrin didn't exist. One of the questions is, are Jews permitted to marry non-Jews? Napoleon asked this question directly to the rabbis of Paris, and this is what they answer. And let's just read it, and then we can discuss it towards the end of the class. Rini, can you help with reading this source? I need you to unmute the ordinances of the Paris Sanhedrin. Go ahead.
The Sanhedrin clarifies that a marriage between Jews and non-Jews conducted in keeping with the civil code is valid for all matters, excuse me, obligatory under the law of the state.
Are you surprised to be reading that? The first thing the Sanhedrin says is it's valid. Marriage between Jew and non-Jew is valid. How? For matters that are obligatory under the law of the state. Okay, keep going.
And even though it is impossible for such a couple to have a binding kiddushin in keeping with the Mosaic religion, they will not be punished by excommunication.
Now that's really interesting. They will not be punished by excommunication. I thought the Radbaz said, I thought he said pretty clearly that if you marry a non-Jew, there is karet on prophetic authority. I thought that the Radbaz said, you need to excommunicate somebody who marries outside of Judaism. But the Paris Sanhedrin here says, we will not do so. We're not going to punish by excommunicating, and not just that, but we'll give the marriage some status, not religious status, but it's a valid marriage for purposes of the laws of the state. Now, this document is, I want you all to think, we'll discuss it later, but what is it that's motivating the rabbis? Why are they suddenly so nice? In the Radbaz was so strict. But what changed in the intervening few centuries to arrive at this language that the Sanhedrin uses, which almost seems like they're ashamed? Why does it say have a binding kiddushin? Like, how the heck is Napoleon supposed to know what kiddushin means? Unless, part of what I think is, unless they're using words that are in a different language, in Hebrew, so that Napoleon doesn't ask any questions. You use the words of a foreign language in order to sort of
Mask.
in order to mask, right, in order to hide what you really think, right? And notice that that is not the first thing that they answer. If you ask me as a rabbi, Rabbi Grover, does Judaism permit the marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew? The first thing I would say is no, it doesn't. But the Paris Sanhedrin is very careful in the way they answer the question. The first thing they say is yes. Yeah, under the laws of the state, and of course they can't have kiddushin. Well, what the heck is that within the Mosaic religion? But we will not be excommunicating anybody. So the pressures of the moment, I think, have a great deal, contemporary pressures have a great deal of influence on the answer that the Paris Sanhedrin gives. Thank you, Rini, for reading. Ellie, would you read for me this responsum, which I think you find almost the opposite of. I don't want to say anything, but read this and let's see how we compare this answer to what the Sanhedrin said above. So this is from 1980, when the Reform movement tackled the issue of intermarriage. Can a Jew marry a non-Jew? And this is what they said.
Okay. May a Reform rabbi officiate at a marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew? What is the attitude of Reform Judaism generally to such a marriage? The Central Conference of American Rabbis, recalling its stand adopted in 1909 that mixed marriage is contrary to the Jewish tradition and should be discouraged, now declares its opposition to participation by its members in any ceremony which solemnizes a mixed marriage. The Central Conference of American Rabbis recognizes that historically its members have held and continue to hold divergent interpretations of Jewish tradition. In order to keep open every channel to Judaism and Klal Yisrael for those who have already entered into mixed marriage, the CCAR calls upon its members: 1, to assist fully in educating children of such mixed marriage as Jews; 2, to provide the opportunity for conversion of the non-Jewish spouse; and 3, to encourage a creative and consistent cultivation of involvement in the Jewish community and the synagogue.
So you can think, thank you, Ellie, you can think carefully about what it is that the reform movement is trying to say. This is 40 years ago, in the way it answers this question, but I want to give you my thoughts. I see what's going on here as almost the exact reverse of what happens with the Sanhedrin and Napoleon's question. Or you might say the exact same thing. Napoleon says, do you permit intermarriage? The answer should have been no, but yada, yada, yada. Okay. May a Reform rabbi officiate at a marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew? The answer should have been yes. If you look very carefully in this source, it says that they are permitted. Reform rabbis are permitted to officiate at an intermarriage. It's just hidden. Just like the Sanhedrin hid their opposition to intermarriage in the word kiddushin, the Reform rabbis hid their permission to officiate at a mixed marriage in this sentence. Ellie, read that again for me.
The Central Conference of American Rabbis recognizes that historically its members have held and continue to hold divergent interpretations of Jewish tradition.
Now, what do you think that means? Ellie, what does that mean?
Well, they were following their own path, but they didn't want it to be brought to the forefront, it seems.
Sorry,
So,
it went mute. Repeat what you just said one more time.
I said the Conference of American Rabbis, they were starting to, it seems to me, open up a different path, but they didn't want it to be brought to the forefront. And so it was sort of subliminal, I think.
Yeah, it's subliminal. I mean, what this sentence means to me is the answer to this question is yes.
Mhm.
May a Reform rabbi officiate at a marriage between a non-Jew and a Jew? Yes, they can. Why? Because we have members who have held and continue to hold divergent interpretations of Jewish tradition, meaning we're not going to stop any rabbi from performing or solemnizing an intermarriage. But we're going to almost cloud that permission with a statement that disapproves of intermarriage, right? Contrary to Jewish tradition and should be discouraged. Opposition to participation by its members in areas. So we're opposed to it. We don't like it, but our rabbis can do it. And this statement at the end, which basically says, okay, listen, there are some things we can all agree on. What we can all agree on is when you have a couple that's already entered into a mixed marriage, or a family where there are mixed faith in the family, well, then we should be welcoming and inclusive and help that family. We shouldn't turn them away. That's something everybody can agree on. But what do we What do we say with regards to officiating at an intermarriage? Well, it seems to me here it's very clear that they are permitting their rabbis to officiate at such a marriage. Now, I'm not clear on whether this was the first time. I should ask a Reform rabbi, I'll get back to you on next class, on whether 1980 was the first time when the Reform movement permitted their rabbis to officiate intermarriage, or whether it had been done before and they just publicized it in 1980. But in 1980, I think you'll find the clearest language, which just reminds me of the statement of the Sanhedrin, in that in the modern period, both statements reveal an ambiguity, a discomfort, a confusion on how to approach the situation. We understand that we live in a world where intermarriage exists. We're not medieval in the sense that we're not turning anybody away or cutting anybody off, but we don't like it and we're not in favor of it. We're sort of tolerating it, and after the fact, not going to turn anybody away. So to end this second unit, I think we will have time today to start the third unit, but to end this second unit of the class, I want to say the following thing. And this is the whole reason why we did this second unit. That if I wanted to make an argument to permit intermarriage, and not to permit intermarriage by saying, hey, I can do whatever I want, I'm going to reinvent Judaism and just turn Judaism into a religion where we can, whatever Grover says goes. But if I wanted to permit intermarriage within the system, using the arguments within the system, I could do so. What would I say? Number one, I would say that the Torah only forbids marriage with the 7 Canaanite nations. So there's no prohibition in the Torah. The Torah only prohibits marriage with an indigenous idolatrous population. And the story in the Torah of Pinchas killing Zimri, remember, with the spear, that's only because they did it in public. But that was not meant to be a broader statement against intermarriage. Third, I would say that the verse in Malachi that we just went over, that Radbaz says is the verse that prohibits intermarriage. Well, I would say no, that verse does not prohibit intermarriage. It only prohibits intermarriage with those who worship foreign gods, only with idolaters. Number 4, when we reviewed Ezra, remember Ezra, who tells the people after the return from Zion, divorce your foreign wives? I could say that Ezra was just responding to the challenges of his time. And we're living in a different time. And just like he responded to his challenges, we should respond to ours. Decision or his suggestion carried no eternal weight, was not supposed to carry forward to future generations without the ability to change. And number 5, I would say that the Hasmonean court and Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, remember the 18 decrees? They were also only concerned with idolaters. And there I would quote Maimonides, who says pretty clearly, we reviewed this last week, Maimonides, who says very clearly that those prohibitions do not apply to a ger toshav. I can drink his wine, or I can sell his wine. Unclear which one. But one can loosen those restrictions with regard to, in his days, Muslims, and in our day, the people who live around us, our neighbors. And I would say, number 6, that Masechet Gerim, which remember Masechet Gerim says, okay, you can be nice to all these ger toshavs, but you still can't marry with them. So how could I get around that? Well, I could say that that was a different kind of ger toshav. The ger toshav that we were speaking about there was a ger toshav who used to be an idolater, but then gave it up and adopted the 7 Noahide laws. But that ger toshav was not a ger toshav who was brought up in a culture where there was no idolatry, who was born to a culture or religion that was non-idolatrous. Those types were not meant to be included in Masechet Gerim. And then number 7, I would say that contemporary Gentiles are not idolaters, and contemporary Gentiles are in fact not threatening to Judaism. And actually, there are many things about non-Jewish culture that we actually admire as Jews. Not only is it not threatening, but they actually have admirable qualities, admirable moral and ethical qualities that are compatible with Judaism. And then finally, I would say, and the majority of Jews don't listen to us anyway and are marrying whoever they want. And don't we have a rule that says you cannot issue a decree upon the people when the majority is not going to abide by it? That is the flow of how an argument would work. If I was to say, I, Rabbi Grover, can posit an argument to permit intermarriage from within the rabbinic tradition, that is what I would stand up and say. Now, to be honest with you, I hope what you've also seen as we've reviewed these sources, is that even though it is possible to posit such an argument, that the argument stands on the shakiest of foundations. It requires you to read a text in a twisted, particular way that always is sort of not the way the majority ever read that text. You have to sort of take a left turn at every single possible intersection as we've traveled along this course in order to get to that point. And only if you're willing to do that, by reading minority sources, can you bring this view to life. And the conservative movement, one of the great challenges that has been leveled at the conservative movement is that is what the conservative movement has done to Jewish law too often. That is, we know we want to arrive at a particular conclusion. Okay? A question gets asked. I'll ask a question that's sort of parav kind of question. Can you eat rice on Passover or not? Well, the conservative movement already decided before they answered the question that they want the answer to be yes. Why? Because there's so many people with celiac disease and they really have a lousy Passover. So we want to permit it. And then in order to get from A to B, we twist and twist and twist and twist and find every little argument that's often a dissenting argument in order to get to where we want to go. So if I ever saw the conservative movement permitting intermarriage, and folks, there are conservative rabbis who would like the movement to permit intermarriage, I could see them putting forward that exact argument. That's what they would say. And what I just said to you about twisting and twisting and twisting is exactly what the response is going to be. It is almost disingenuous. It's such a complicated, non-normative path to arriving at your conclusion that it reeks of disingenuousness. Is that a word?
It is now.
Okay, sorry. You know what I mean. It reeks of disingenuousness. It's fake, it's false. But it could be possible. Now, before I open up for the discussion, I want to introduce what we're going to be doing in part 3. I will get disingenuity. Thank you, Dr. Rose. I'm going to send you the Dropbox link so you can download the third part of this lecture. There, you should see it in your chat box. And also, if you'd like me to send you a copy of this of these sources, just send me an email, jrgrover@gmail.com. But I will share with you what we're going to do in this third part. In the third part of this class, I'm asking the question, well, if we were to permit intermarriage, what would that look like? What would change about Judaism? What would need to change about Judaism? How could it work? How might Judaism need to be modified in order to permit such a change in such an unprecedented change in Jewish practice? And I'm going to review with you, I think it's 4 different models for how it could work. 4 different models for how it could work. And if you know me by now, you know that I'll also be critiquing each one of these 4 models, each one of its weaknesses. And this is really what brings us to the summation of this class. What is it that is truly at stake in this argument? And something that I asked right at the beginning of this class, which is our debate, the contemporary debate around intermarriage, really about intermarriage? Or is it about something else? Is it about competing ideas for what Judaism is and what it ought to be that is really at the heart of this debate? And intermarriage is just the victim. The debate around intermarriage is just the victim of really 2 fundamentally different kinds of visions for what Judaism ought to be in the world today. Well, you can sort of hear in the way I'm positing this that I do believe that that's the case. I do think that the debate around intermarriage is not really about intermarriage. But what is it about? Well, we won't know unless you stick around for 2 more classes where we'll be going through these 4 different visions of what Judaism would look like if we did permit intermarriage, and why each one of them takes something away from Judaism that we might not want to take away. Okay,